There is a particular kind of quiet that comes from a show you have already seen. You are not watching for what happens next, because you already know what happens next. Mordecai and Rigby are going to make a bad decision, and the bad decision is going to open a hole in the sky. And the hole in the sky is going to be closed by the end of the 11 minutes, and the park is going to look exactly the same tomorrow. Knowing all of this is not boredom. It is the opposite of boredom. When the mind no longer has to track a story, it can rest inside the sound of it. The low, patient rhythm of Benson losing his temper in the same way he always does. The synth cues that rise at the same moments they have always risen. You half hear it. You drift under it. The voices become a room you already know how to move through in the dark. Tonight goes underneath that familiar room and looks at the small errors it was built from. Across the next 2 hours, this is a slow walk through 100 mistakes hidden inside the lore of regular show, the continuity slips, and background inconsistencies and quiet contradictions that were drawn, logged, and aired without anyone catching them, and that you have watched past 100 times without ever once seeing. There is a reason they exist, and it is worth sitting with. Regular show was not written in the ordinary sense. The board artists wrote the dialogue and drew the drawings themselves, working from an outline rather than a finished script, and a single episode could take up to 9 months to move from that outline to the screen. Quase 16.000 planos eram registrados à mão, quadro a quadro, pelo diretor de animação em folhas de exposição, antes de seguirem para os animadores em Seul lhes darem vida, com cerca de 20 episódios vivos no processo a qualquer momento. In that much motion, small things slip through. Welcome to Velvo. There is nothing here you need to follow, and nothing you need to remember. Settle in, let the lights go low, and let the voices carry you down while we look, very slowly, at everything they missed. To understand why a show contradicts itself, you have to understand how it was made. And regular show was made in a way that almost invited the small mistakes this video is going to spend the next 2 hours tracing. It was not a scripted show in the way most people imagine a scripted show. There was no finished screenplay handed down from a writer's room. No locked document that the rest of the production simply illustrated. The creator, J.G. Quintel, described the process plainly. The board artists, as he described it, were the ones who wrote the dialogue and drew the drawings themselves. The words and the images arrived together, from the same hands, at the same stage. Think about what that means for a moment. In a conventional cartoon, the script comes first and acts as a kind of contract. Every department downstream can point back to it. If a character says something in episode 40 that contradicts episode 10, in theory the script is the place where that gets caught. Regular show did not work that way. The writers produced only a basic outline of an episode, a skeleton, and then handed it off. It went to the lead storyboard artist and supervising director, Calvin Wong, and to his team. From that thin outline, they developed the actual dialogue, the actual jokes, the actual staging of every shot. The outline told them roughly what happened. Almost everything else was invented at the drawing board. That is a beautiful way to make comedy. It puts the funniest people closest to the paper, and it lets a joke be discovered in the act of drawing it, rather than typed out cold in a document weeks earlier. It is also, if you are being honest about it, a system with a very particular blind spot. When the writing and the drawing happen at the same moment, and when the person doing both is thinking primarily about whether this scene works, whether this gag lands, whether this shot flows into the next, the long memory of the whole series is not really anyone's job in that room. Consistency across an 8-season run is not a thing you can hold in your head while you are staging a single fight or a single conversation. The corrections did come. They simply came late. Notes on a finished storyboard were given afterward, in a writer's room session, once the board already existed as art and dialogue on the page. And those notes were given in a specific order, by seniority. Quintel first, then Wong, then the other senior staff, and the newer writers, people like Patrick Baker, came last. There is nothing sinister in that structure. It is an ordinary way to run a room. But notice the timing. The moment where someone might say, "Wait, did we not already establish this differently?" arrived after the storyboard was drawn, not before. The art and the words already existed by the time anyone stepped back to check them against the rest of the series. A note at that stage can fix a line. It is far harder for it to catch a quiet contradiction with something that aired 2 seasons ago, because catching that would require someone in the room to be carrying the entire series in memory, at speed, while also judging whether the episode in front of them is good. Now layer the clock on top of that. A single episode of regular show took up to 9 months to complete, from the first stages to the last. 9 months for 11 minutes of television. And these episodes did not move through the pipeline one at a time, politely waiting their turn. The team typically had around 20 episodes in some stage of production simultaneously. Picture that. 20 separate stories, all at different points, all being drawn and revised and animated in overlapping waves by people who were also thinking about the 19 others. An artist working on the boards for one episode was not necessarily aware of a decision being made that same week on the boards for another episode that would air near it. Continuity is a memory problem, and this was a workplace where the memory was spread across 20 moving projects and dozens of people at once. The sheer volume of the drawing tells you how much labor sat behind each of those 11 minutes. Nearly 16,000 frames were hand-drawn and logged for a single episode. 16,000. Every one of them a physical thing that had to be made, numbered, tracked, and kept in order. A crew of roughly 35 people worked at Cartoon Network Studios in Burbank, California, handling that early creative and drawing work before the assets were shipped overseas to Seram Animation in South Korea, where the episodes were actually animated. So the show's memory was not only spread across 20 episodes and 35 people in Burbank, it was also spread across an ocean. The people who set the look and the intent were not the same people in the same building who brought those 16,000 frames to full motion. Every handoff is a place where a small detail can drift, and this production had handoffs built into its very shape, and the drawing itself was done the old way, on purpose. Regular show was animated traditionally, by hand, on paper, pencils and pens and light boxes and electric erasers. This was a deliberate choice by Quintel, made at a time when much of the industry was moving to drawing digitally on Cintiq tablets. He wanted the organic, slightly varied look that paper gives you, the sense that a human hand made each line and that no two were mechanically identical. It is one of the reasons the show feels warm rather than slick, but warmth and variation are, in a sense, the opposite of perfect consistency. A digital asset can be copied exactly, pixel for pixel, from one shot to the next. A drawing made fresh on paper is always a new drawing. The very method that gave the series its handmade charm also meant that a background object, a piece of clothing, a small feature of a character, was being redrawn by hand each time rather than pasted in unchanged. Small drift is not a flaw in that system. It is a natural consequence of it. To see why regular show was built this loosely, you have to go back to where it started. Regular show began as a pilot for a Cartoon Network program called Cartoonstitute, and the entire point of that program was freedom. It was explicitly designed to let young artists make shorts without network interference and without focus group testing. No committee shaping the material toward a safe average. No round of notes from executives trying to sand off the edges. The whole spirit of the thing was to hand talented people the tools and get out of their way. That spirit is the reason regular show sounds and feels the way it does. Strange and specific, and unmistakably the product of particular imaginations, rather than a boardroom. It is also, if you follow the logic honestly, the same spirit that lets small inconsistencies through. A process built to minimize outside control is a process with fewer checkpoints, fewer gates, where a stranger stops the work and asks whether every detail lines up with everything that came before. And then the show had to move fast. Cartoon Network greenlit the series on the 14th of August 2009, and it premiered on the 6th of September 2010. That is about 13 months from the pickup of the series to its arrival on air. 13 months to take a Cartoonstitute short and build it into a working weekly production, to assemble the crew, to establish the world and its rules and its look, and to begin feeding that 9-month, 20 episodes at once pipeline. A show being invented at that pace is making a great many decisions quickly and early, before anyone knows which of them will need to hold firm across years of stories. Some of what looks like a mistake later is really just an early choice that no one expected to be tested so many times. Because the run did not stop soon. Regular show ran for 8 seasons and roughly 244 episodes, from September 2010 all the way to January 2017. Multiply the pressures. 244 separate stories, each one worth up to 9 months and nearly 16,000 hand-drawn frames, each one written and drawn at the same time by bored artists working from a thin outline, each one checked for continuity only after the fact, and only by a room ordered by seniority. All of it spread across some 20 simultaneous episodes, and 35 people in Burbank, and an animation studio on the far side of the Pacific. Over 7 years, across that much handmade work, the surprising thing is not that the details occasionally fail to match. The surprising thing is how often, given all of this, they actually do. So when the coming chapters point out that a character's history shifts, that an object changes between shots, that a rule the series established bends a season later, hold this picture in your mind. None of it comes from carelessness in the ordinary sense. It comes from a specific set of conditions. A board-driven method that fused writing and drawing into one late-formed decision. A schedule measured in months and stacked 20 deep. A handmade, on-paper craft that resisted exact repetition by its nature. And a founding philosophy that prized freedom over supervision. Those conditions made the show what it is. Funny and warm and alive. They are also, in the end, the reason there is anything for the rest of this video to find. Before regular show existed as a show, it existed twice as something smaller, and both of those earlier things contradict what the finished series would eventually insist was always true. This is the strange thing about Origins. A show that runs for 8 seasons builds a mythology, and that mythology gets treated as bedrock, as if it were laid down before anything else. But the drawings came first, and the drawings remember a different story. To understand how much regular show later rewrote itself, you have to go back to 2 student films made at the California Institute of the Arts, years before Mordecai and Rigby had a park to neglect. The first is called The Naive Man from Lollyland, and J.G. Quintel made it in 2005. It runs roughly 4 minutes, barely enough time to set up the joke before it ends. It is hand-drawn in pencil, which gives it a softness, an unfinished warmth, that the polished series would later trade away for clean digital lines. It premiered at the Nicktoons Film Festival on the 24th of August that year, and it did well there. It reportedly picked up a couple of awards there, which for a student film is a strong signal that something in it was working. What was working, in hindsight, was a character. That character is the one who would become Pops. But he is not Pops here. He is not named Pops at all. In the short, he is only ever referred to as the Naive Man, or as the Ambassador from Lollyland. And those 2 descriptions tell you almost everything about who he was before the series decided who he would be. He is naive. He is an ambassador. He comes from somewhere, and he is a visitor. Sam Marin voices him, the same performer who would voice Pops for the entire run of the series, and yet the voice is not the same. Marin plays him with a delivery notably less falsetto than the high, fragile, almost otherworldly register he would later settle into. Listen for that difference, and you can hear a character still being found. The lollipop-headed man is there on the page, but the sound of him has not arrived yet. And then there is Lollyland itself, which is the detail that matters most, because it is the one the series would most completely overturn. In the 2005 short, Lollyland is not a planet, it is a country. It is portrayed as a real foreign nation on Earth, styled after the United Kingdom, a place with the manners and the flavor of somewhere across an ocean. And the ambassador visits the United States from it, the way any diplomat visits from any nation. That is the whole premise of his naivety. He is a foreigner abroad, out of his depth, encountering a culture that is not his. Everything about the joke depends on Lollyland being a place you could, in principle, fly to on a normal airplane. Now hold that image, the earthbound country, the diplomat, the pencil lines, and set it against what regular show would eventually claim in its 8th season. Because in that final arc the series reveals Pops' true identity, and the reveal is enormous. He is not a diplomat, he is not from a country. He is Megacranus, an alien deity, born on the planet Lollyland, and he has a twin brother, the villain Anti-Pops, whose name is Malum Cranus. Lollyland, in this telling, is cosmic. It is a world out in space, the birthplace of gods, and the gentle naive man is one half of a celestial pair locked in a fight over the fate of everything. Measure that as an act of revision. The show took a small UK-esque nation invented for a 12-minute student film and, more than a decade later, recast it as a planet at the scale of myth. The name stayed. The meaning of the name changed entirely. There is more from Lollyland that survived into the series, and it survived almost untouched, which makes the changes to Pops feel even stranger by contrast. In the short, there is no taxi driver at all, only the two clerks behind the counter, and one of them slowly turns into a rough early version of Benson. His taxi can fly. Both of those things were carried forward. That drugged clerk eventually became the gumball machine character who runs the park and never stops being exasperated, while Carmenita, Pops' flying car, would only show up much later, in a completely different episode. So two of the show's fixtures, a name and a gag, were lifted intact from a student film, while the character who was arguably the emotional center of that same film had his entire nature rewritten. The pieces the series kept, it kept faithfully. The piece it built its finale around, it reinvented. The second short is where the contradictions get stranger still. It is called 2 in the AM PM, and Quintel made it in 2006, again at CalArts. This one was never officially released. It leaked online as an animatic, a rough stage of animation, storyboards timed to sound but not yet fully drawn, which means the version most people have seen was never meant to be seen at all. The story is small and nocturnal. Two human clerks are working the overnight shift at a gas station store on Halloween. They eat candy that has been laced with acid, and they hallucinate. That is the film. Two people, a night shift, a bad trip. And out of that trip come two figures you will recognize. One of the clerks hallucinates a blue jay called Mordecai. The other hallucinates a gumball machine called Benson. Hold that for a moment, because it inverts the entire ontology of the series. In regular show, Mordecai is a real person, or a real bird, a being who exists independently, who has a job and a best friend and an inner life. In the animatic, he is not real. He is explicitly a drug-induced hallucination, a thing conjured by a human mind on acid, with no existence of his own. Benson, too, the future authority figure, the responsible one, first appears as something a tripping clerk sees that is not there. The characters the show would build a stable, grounded world around began as evidence that the world was not stable at all. The voices tell you who was pairing with whom. Quintel himself voices the clerk who hallucinates Mordecai, and Sam Marin voices the clerk who hallucinates Benson. So in this earliest version, before the series existed, the central duo is Mordecai and Benson. They are the pair. And the reason they are the pair is simple and worth stating plainly, because it reshapes how you understand the finished series. Rigby had not been created yet. Mordecai's raccoon best friend, the other half of every scheme, the partner in every argument and every game and every disaster across the whole run of the series, does not appear anywhere in that short. He does not exist in 2006. The friendship that the series treats as its foundation, Mordecai and Rigby against the world, had not been invented when Mordecai first walked, or rather hallucinated, onto a screen. His original partner was Benson. So by the time you reach the actual show, two full versions of this material already exist, and both disagree with it. Pops was a diplomat, not a god. Lollyland was a country, not a planet. Mordecai was a hallucination, not a person. Rigby was nothing at all. And then, in 2009, the real pilot arrived, and it too tells a story the series would go on to abandon. That pilot was made for a Cartoon Network project called the Cartoonstitute, a shorts anthology that the network shelved. It was released on Cartoon Network's website on the 14th day of August, 2009. Here, finally, the pieces snap into something close to the show we know. Mordecai and Rigby exist, both of them, together. But even this near-final version contains an origin the aired series would never show again or even mention. In the pilot, Mordecai and Rigby are introduced answering a help-wanted advertisement for park groundskeepers. They apply for the job, and they are hired on the spot, personally, by Pops Maillard. That is how they come to work at the park. It is a clean, specific origin story, the two of them walking in off an ad and being taken on by the Lollipop Man himself, and it is a story the series then buried without ceremony. Across every aired episode, that hiring is never depicted, never referenced. The characters are simply already there, as if they had always been there. The plot of that pilot is worth describing, because it shows the series arriving at its own tone before it arrived at its own continuity. Mordecai and Rigby play a game of rock, paper, scissors over Pops's old chair, an uncomfortable one that nobody wants to keep. The game escalates, and the escalation, in the way these things go, accidentally summons a black hole, a dispute over furniture opening a hole in reality. That is the register the show would keep, the collision of the mundane and the cosmic, two friends bickering over nothing and tearing the sky. The tone was ready in 2009. The mythology was not, and would not stop shifting for years. What all of this leaves you with is a show whose deepest claims about itself were assembled late and layered over drawings that said something else. The finished regular show wants you to believe Pops was always Megacranus, that Lollyland was always a planet, that Mordecai and Rigby were always the pair, that the park was always their place. The student films and the pilot remember a diplomat, a country, a hallucination, a job interview. None of it is a mistake in the ordinary sense. It is a record of a story deciding what it was going to be, kept accidentally on film, and left where anyone patient enough could find it. Consider what a character model actually is before any of it moves. It is a fixed drawing, a template, a set of agreed shapes that every animator is meant to hold to so that a blue jay in one shot is unmistakably the same blue jay in the next. The designs for regular show were built by Ben Adams, and those designs are the ground truth against which everything that follows can be measured. What makes the early seasons so strange to look at now, once you know where to point your eye, is how often the series departs from that ground truth. The template exists. The show does not always obey it. Begin with Mordecai's mouth, because it is the clearest tell. In several of the earliest episodes, his mouth is drawn connected directly to his snout, running as one continuous shape across prolonged shots, rather than sitting as a separate feature the way it does in the series most people remember. You can find this in the very first episode, The Power, and you can find it again at the start of Season 2 in Gov'nor. It is not a single stray frame. It is a way of drawing the character that held for extended stretches, and then, later, largely went away. Once you notice it, the early Mordecai starts to look subtly like a different bird wearing the same colors. The full list of episodes where this connected mouth persists is worth holding in mind, because it maps almost perfectly onto the show's opening run. The Power, Just Set Up the Chairs, Caffeinated Concert Tickets, Meet Your Maker, Grilled Cheese Deluxe, Rigby's Body, Gov'nor, and First Day. These are, more or less, the beginning of everything, and across them, the character's face is being drawn in a manner he almost never receives once the series settles. Consider how that lands for a viewer coming to these episodes fresh. The drift is not hidden in obscure corners. It is on the protagonist's face, in the first thing you ever see him do. First Day deserves its own slow look, because it is a stranger object than its place in the running order suggests. It aired as the pilot episode, numbered as the 25th entry of Season 2, and it is an extended cut of the original 2009 Cartoonstitute short. The short ran about 7 minutes. First Day runs closer to 11, with newly animated footage stitched into the original pilot material to fill the gap. So a single episode contains two different vintages of the series at once, sitting side by side, and the seam between them is visible if you are watching for it. Part of it is the series as it would become. Part of it is the series before it had fully decided what it was. The older footage gives itself away through motion. The animation in the original pilot material is noticeably more bouncy and more cartoonish than the regular series, leaning on heavier squash and stretch, with smear frames used to blur fast movement in a way the later series mostly restrains. Characters compress and rebound more. The elasticity is turned up. It is the difference between a style still reaching for broad, rubbery comedy and a style that has since learned to hold its shape steadier. And inside that older footage, Rigby carries the same quiet anomaly Mordecai does. In the reused pilot material, Rigby is repeatedly drawn with his mouth connected to his snout, a rendering he is very rarely given across the rest of the series. So First Day preserves, almost like a fossil, a version of both characters that the show would spend years leaving behind. There is a fan-authored analysis on the regular show wiki forum, an art evolution study, that tries to give this drift a shape and a chronology, and its framework is useful precisely because it refuses to treat the show as one smooth object. The poster divides the visual style into distinct eras. The 2009 pilot stands alone, then Season 1, then Season 2, then early Season 3, then a longer band running from mid to late Season 3 through Season 4, and finally the long back half, Seasons 5 through 8. 6 eras for a single show, each with its own handwriting. That division alone tells you the model did not hold still. It moved in stages, and the stages have edges you can point to. Season 1, in that analysis, is described as the era of bold, jagged, thick outlines, with the character models frequently drawn off-model, meaning inconsistent from shot to shot, even while the animation itself stays fluid. Sit with that combination for a moment, because it is a specific and slightly contradictory thing. The movement is confident. The drawing underneath the movement is not yet locked down. A character can be animated beautifully and still not quite match itself from one cut to the next. That is Season 1, as the study frames it. The energy arrived before the discipline did. Then something tightens. From Season 2 through the middle of Season 3, the same analysis says the models became more consistently on-model while the animation stayed fluid, and the poster names this stretch the best animated run of the entire series. This is the sweet spot in their reading, the window where the two things that pulled against each other in Season 1 finally pull together. The drawings hold their shape, and the motion stays alive at the same time. If you want to see the series at its most visually settled, this is where the study sends you, and it is a modest, defensible claim rather than a grand one. The specific measurements are where this stops being a vibe and becomes something you can check against the frame. The analysis notes that the black rings around Rigby's eyes are drawn smaller in the later seasons than they are in Season 1. Go back and the Season 1 rings really are heavier, thicker, more of the face given over to that dark circle. And it notes that Mordecai's beak is drawn shorter starting around Season 2, alongside a changed body shape, a shorter beak, a different silhouette. These are small numbers, a few pixels of ring, a slightly clipped bill, but they compound. Enough small adjustments, and the character you are watching in Season 1 is measurably not the character you are watching in Season 5, even though nothing about him was ever announced as changing. That is the quiet argument these facts make together. The design was fixed on paper by one hand, and then the making of the show, episode after episode, studio pass after studio pass, slowly bent it. The connected mouth on Mordecai's face in The Power. The bouncier, smear-heavy pilot animation surfacing inside First Day. The connected mouth on Rigby in that same reused footage. The thick, jagged Season 1 outlines giving way to steadier models by Season 2. The eye rings shrinking, the beak shortening, the body reshaping. None of it is dramatic on its own. All of it, taken as a sequence, is a character quietly drifting away from its own template, while insisting it is exactly the same. My own view, for whatever it is worth, is that this is what makes the early seasons more interesting to study than the polished later ones. You are not watching a finished object, you are watching one still deciding what it looks like. There is a version of Skips that exists only in the first season, before the series knew what it wanted him to be. In Death Punchies, the 4th episode of that season, he is nothing more than an unusually tough park worker, a piece of set dressing built out of muscle. The episode is not about him, it is about Mordecai and Rigby and the game they play called Punchies, the one where Mordecai always wins because everyone always wins against Rigby. To make that point land, Mordecai reminds his friend of an old humiliation, a time when Skips hit Mordecai so hard during Punchies that Mordecai needed surgery on his butt. That is the whole function of Skips in the line. He is a benchmark for pain, a name you invoke to describe damage. Watch how casually the show treats him here, because that casualness matters later. When Rigby steals a page from the Death Kwon-do instructor's notebook, a page titled The Death Punch of Death, and begins field testing the move around the park, Skips is simply one more body in the lineup. Rigby attacks Muscle Man, then High Five Ghost, then Pops, then Skips. and the episode gives no sign that Skips is anything other than an ordinary worker who happens to hit hard. No immortality, no ancient grief, no centuries behind the eyes. If you were watching in order, in the autumn it first aired, you would have no reason to think this Yeti was anything more than the strongest guy on the crew. And then the very next episode changes everything, quietly, without announcement. Free Cake aired on the 4th of October 2010, and it is the first episode to reveal that Skips is immortal. It shows him performing an annual ritual, a spirit dance, for a set of cosmic beings that look like babies, called the Guardians of Eternal Youth. He does this dance every year to renew his eternal youth. Set that against the character we just met. The park worker with the punishing right hook is, it turns out, held in place by a yearly bargain with cosmic forces. The show has taken its benchmark for pain and revealed a second floor beneath him, and it has done so only one episode after treating him as furniture. This is the pattern that defines Skips across the whole series. The series does not sit down and tell you who he is. It leaks him. It gives you a piece, lets it settle, and years later gives you another piece that does not quite line up with the first. What you are watching, across seasons, is a character being assembled out of contradictions that were never reconciled in advance, because they were never planned together. Consider Diary, which arrives in 2012, in the 3rd season. By now the audience has a question that the earliest episodes never bothered to raise, which is why Skip skips. Why a creature that powerful moves everywhere with that particular bouncing gait? Diary offers an answer, a complete and standalone one. Skip skips, the episode explains, because he made a vow. He swore to skip for the rest of his life to remember a woman he loved, a woman who sacrificed herself to save him from a villain named Clorgbane. It is a clean, self-contained origin for a single detail. It does not require you to know anything else. It hands you the woman, the sacrifice, the villain, and the vow, all in one closed loop, and it asks you to accept that this is the reason. Hold on to that, because the show will return to it and rearrange it. In Bald Spot, in the 4th season, the reveals turn numeric for the first time. Skips tells Muscleman that it took him about 400 years to get used to being bald. It is a throwaway line, delivered in the register of a complaint, but it is one of the earliest concrete hints at his true age. 400 years just to make peace with a bald spot. The number is not the point so much as what it implies, a lifespan long enough that ordinary human adjustments take centuries. The immortality that Free Cake showed as ritual is now being measured, lightly, in the language of time. Then the series does something stranger. In A Skips in Time, which aired on the 30th of September, 2013, in the 5th season, a teenage version of Skips arrives in the present. He comes through a hot air balloon accident, pulled forward from the past, and he is still going by his original name, Walks. And here is the detail that tells you how carefully it is guarding its own chronology. This young Walks shows no knowledge of Clorgbane and no knowledge of being immortal. The grief that Diary made the center of the character, the villain, the vow, none of it exists in him yet. He is a boy from before the story started. The show is telling you that everything you know about Skips happens to a person who was once someone else, someone whole, someone without the wound. That name, Walks, is the hinge the whole character turns on, and the series waits until Skips' story to swing it. Skip's Story is a half-hour special that aired on the 14th of April 2014, and it is the first episode to fully dramatize his origin. It confirms that his original name was Walks, and it places him as a student at a high school styled after the 1980s. Everything the earlier episodes hinted at is now given a single frame, and crucially, the special reworks the reason for his immortality. In Free Cake, the Guardians renewed his youth through a yearly dance, and that was all we knew. Here, the Guardians grant Walks immortality for a purpose. They give it to him specifically so that he can keep fighting Clorgbane, the villain fated to return to Earth every 157 years. The dance from the first season is now revealed to be maintenance on a weapon. He is kept young so he can keep swinging. And the vow from Diary is given its full shape. Skip's Story reveals that Walks renamed himself Skips after his girlfriend, Mona, whose full name is Desdemona, was killed by Clorgbane. The woman who sacrificed herself, unnamed in the 3rd season, now has a name and a face and a place in a high school hallway. The skip that diary, framed purely as an act of memory, is joined to something harder, because the special also shows that Walks gained the fists of justice to take revenge on Clorgbane. The mourning and the vengeance sit in the same origin. He carries her by moving a certain way, and he carries her by hitting. Now stand back and look at what the series has done across 4 years and 5 seasons. It started with a park worker whose only trait was that his punch once required surgery. It made him immortal in the following episode. It gave him a private reason for a walk, then a number for his age, then a younger self who knew none of it, and finally a full history that rewrote the terms of everything that came before. The fists of justice, the revenge, the name change, all of it reaches back and re-explains that surgery joke from Death Punchies. The strongest guy on the crew was strong because he was built, by cosmic beings, into a weapon against a returning god. Nobody watching the 4th episode of the 1st season could have known that. The show did not know it yet either. And that, more than any single reveal, is what makes Skips the most interesting act of assembly in the series. A character whose past was written backward into a joke. Consider what it means for a show to own a place before it has decided how that place came to be owned. Regular show introduces Mr. Maillard in the Season 2 episode called Dizzy, a small man voiced with dry gravity by David Ogden Stiers. And from that first appearance, he is simply a fact of the world. He owns the park. Benson answers to him. The chain of authority runs upward from the groundskeepers to Benson, and from Benson to this elderly figure who arrives, disapproves, and leaves. The show never pauses to explain him. He is presented the way most cartoons present their absent authority, as a given rather than a question, and for a long stretch of the series that is enough. Nobody watching in those early seasons needed to know where the deed came from. The park existed, and someone signed the checks, and his name was Maillard. That quiet arrangement is worth holding in mind, because the contradiction this chapter is concerned with is not a single dramatic reveal. It is the slow discovery that the series never actually built the foundation it kept standing on. The ownership of the park, the thing that anchors every workplace conflict and every threat to the grounds, was assembled piecemeal, across episodes separated by years, and it was assembled in an order that does not match the order a careful writer would have chosen. The clearest evidence of that improvisation is the episode most people would expect to settle the question, and it does not. Exit 9B opens the 4th season, and its entire plot turns on who has the right to the land. A freeway is planned, an off-ramp designated Exit 9B, and the park lies directly in its path. The crisis is a crisis of property and permanence, and yet Mr. Maillard, the established owner of that property, does not appear in the episode at all. Think about what that absence means structurally. The one character whose signature and whose title should matter most in a fight over the park's survival is simply not present. It reaches for a different solution entirely. The staff resolve the threat by going to City Hall and signing a document that declares the park a historical landmark. Once the park is a landmark, the freeway becomes illegal to build, and the off-ramp dies on paper. It is a clever escape, and it is also a revealing one. The park is saved not by its owner asserting his rights, but by the employees themselves reaching over the ownership structure and appealing to the state. In an episode entirely about who controls this land, the man who controls this land is invisible, and the workers improvise a legal maneuver to keep their own workplace intact. The series, in other words, did not yet have an ownership story worth telling, so it told a landmark story instead. Exit 9B carries a second, smaller crack that is easy to miss but tells the same story about a show writing quickly and trusting the audience not to check. The episode contains a flashback in which Benson appears to recall events from the earlier episode Weekend at Benson's from the 3rd season. The trouble is that in Weekend at Benson's, Benson was unconscious for the very events he now seems to remember. He could not have witnessed them. This is not a deep contradiction, only a continuity seam, but it sits comfortably beside the larger one. A show that lets a character remember what he slept through is a show operating on momentum rather than on a locked and consistent history. The past is being drawn as it becomes useful, not consulted from a fixed record. The episode that finally explains how Mr. Maillard came to own the park does not arrive until the 8th season, in an episode called The Ice Tape. That is a remarkable distance to travel. For roughly 6 seasons, the audience accepts an owner whose claim has no origin, and only near the end of the series does it hand one over. In the ice tape, a holographic message from Maillard reveals that he bought the park from its previous owner, a man named Jebediah Townhouse, who signed the deed over to him. That is the whole mechanism: a purchase, a signature, a transfer. It is almost deliberately ordinary, and its ordinariness is the point. The founding of the park, the thing Exit 9B could not lean on, turns out to be a plain real estate transaction revealed years after it would have been most useful. The ice tape does not stop at the deed. The same holographic message reveals that Pops, whom the series had long treated as Maillard's son, is not his biological child at all. Pops is an alien from the planet Lollyland, found as a baby inside a meteor during one of Maillard's expeditions and adopted by him. Set that beside the ownership reveal and notice what the episode is really doing. It is retroactively filling 2 of the oldest blanks in the series at once: the origin of the owner's fortune and the origin of the owner's family, and it is doing both in the 8th season through a recorded message rather than a lived scene. The backstory is not dramatized as it happens. It is delivered, later, as exposition, because it was decided later. Even Jebediah Townhouse, the previous owner named in the ice tape, did not begin as a piece of the ownership puzzle. He had appeared earlier, in a Halloween segment called The Previous Owner, part of Terror Tales of the Park 3. There he is depicted as the original owner of the land in the 18th century, roughly 200 years before the show's present day. When that segment aired, it was a spooky one-off, a haunted former proprietor for a horror anthology. Only afterward, in the ice tape, does that ghost become load-bearing, the named seller at the start of the park's actual chain of title. A character invented for a Halloween scare is promoted, after the fact, into the foundation of the property's history. The chronology of these episodes is where the whole pattern becomes undeniable, so it is worth laying the dates side by side. Exit 9B aired on the 1st of October, 2012, and offered no owner and no origin. Terror Tales of the Park 3, with its 18th century previous owner, aired on the 21st of October, 2013, more than a year later. And the ice tape, which finally binds the deed, the seller, and the adopted alien son together, arrived in November of 2016, roughly 3 years after that. The park's ownership backstory was not established early, and it was not established in Exit 9B, the episode that seemed to demand it. It was assembled across 3 widely separated episodes, in an order driven by what each episode happened to need, and then stitched together in retrospect. That is the contradiction, and it is a gentler thing than a betrayal. Regular show did not lie to its audience so much as it deferred. It built a world in which someone owned the park, and it trusted that the owning was enough, and it postponed the explanation until the explanation could be made to serve a late series episode about legacy. My own view is that this is less a flaw in the writing than an honest fingerprint of how the show was made, one improvised necessity at a time, each episode solving its own problem and leaving the deeper history for later. The park always had an owner. It simply did not always have an origin. And when the origin finally came, it came in fragments, years apart, asking the audience to look back and assemble the deed themselves. Consider the ordinary strangeness of Benson, the manager who runs the park and answers to almost no one, and yet has never been given a species. Mordecai is a blue jay. Rigby is a raccoon. You can name what they are in a single word, the way you would in a field guide. Benson resists that entirely. The only official classification the series has ever offered is not zoological but descriptive, the sort of thing you would write on a caption rather than in a taxonomy. The Wikipedia entry drawn from the show's own material calls him a grumpy, austere, no-nonsense but well-meaning, middle-aged, 5'4" anthropomorphic gumball machine. Notice what that amounts to as a definition. It tells you his temperament, his height, and his manufacture, and it stops there, because there is no animal underneath to name. That absence is not an oversight. It is the residue of how Benson was assembled, piece by piece, out of older ideas that had nothing to do with a gumball machine and everything to do with a working artist reusing what he had. Long before regular show, J.G. Quintel made an independent short called 2 in the AM PM, and inside it stands a convenience store clerk who eats drugged candy and turns into a figure with a gumball machine for a head. That clerk was voiced by Sam Marin, the same performer who would later give Benson his voice. So the shape existed first, tried out in a smaller and stranger context, a prototype waiting for a name and a job. The name, meanwhile, was living an entirely separate life. Quintel had used it back in 2005, in a CalArts student short called The Naive Man, from Lollyland, where Benson was not a machine at all, but a human taxi driver. A person. A minor character with a common name, the kind you forget as soon as the credits run. Years later, that name was lifted off the taxi driver and set onto the gumball machine manager, and the two halves of Benson, the borrowed body and the borrowed name, finally met. Neither was designed for the other. They were joined because they were both already there, in Quintel's own back catalog, ready to be recombined. Even the conception of the character passed through a false start, a placeholder that got left behind. By interview accounts, before Quintel arrived at a gumball machine, he had been picturing something far more conventional. The sitcom butler Mr. Belvedere, a starched and formal presence. The idea of a manager as a kind of exasperated household authority. Hold that image next to what Benson became. The butler was the emotional template, the tone, the fussy dignity of a man who keeps everything running while everyone around him refuses to help. The gumball machine was the body that eventually carried that tone. One is a species of comic character. The other is a vending device. Benson is the seam where they were welded together. And the machine itself arrived by chance, not design, which is the detail that undoes any attempt to read Benson as a coherent creature. The interview accounts trace the gumball concept to a CalArts class exercise, the kind of deliberately arbitrary prompt art schools use to break students out of their habits. Students drew a random word from a hat and were told to design a character from whatever they pulled. Quintel drew the word candy. What he produced from that word became the design that became Benson. So the single most defining fact about him, that he is a gumball machine rather than a fox or a bird or a man, comes down to a slip of paper in a hat. There is no inner logic to recover, because the logic was randomness, wearing the mask of a lesson. Now here is where the show begins to argue with its own premise, slowly, over years, in a way most viewers never stack up side by side. A gumball machine is glass and metal. It does not grow anything. And yet the writing keeps giving Benson organic facial hair, as though some part of the production could not stop treating him as flesh. In the episode Peeps, there is visible stubble on him, the ordinary 5 o'clock shadow of a middle-aged man who has had a long day. In Jinx, his negative counterpart, the demon version of him, wears a full beard. In More Smarter, his so-called barbaric form again carries stubble. Each of these belongs to its own episode, its own gag, its own logic, and taken one at a time, none of them looks like a mistake. Taken together, they describe a machine that keeps sprouting hair it has no biological right to grow. You can feel the series reaching, at one point, for a way to reconcile this. Benton Connor, the longest-serving storyboard artist on the series, the person who boarded more episodes than anyone else and therefore knew the character's face better than almost anyone, is credited with an observation that tries to make the beard native to the design. He noted that the arrangement of Benson's gumballs, the rounded cluster of them behind the glass, loosely resembles the shape of a beard. It is a lovely piece of retroactive reading, the kind of thing that makes you look at the character again and see something you had missed. The gumballs as a beard drawn in candy. A face that was always bearded, if you squinted. But notice what the show itself does to that idea. If the gumballs were meant to stand in for a beard, then a beard would be unnecessary, already present in the design. And yet Peeps gives him real stubble, and Jinx gives his demon a real beard, and More Smarter gives his barbaric self real stubble again. The writing keeps growing hair on a machine that, by one artist's generous account, was already wearing its beard in glass. The observation and the episodes cancel each other out. That, in the end, is the truest thing about Benson's species. There is no fact to settle, because it never decided he was one thing. He is a name that once belonged to a taxi driver, a body that once belonged to a drugged clerk, a temperament borrowed from a butler, and a form pulled from a word in a hat, and the hair that keeps appearing on him is simply the last small proof that no single account of what he is was ever meant to hold. There is a small moment inside Muscle Woman, the 14th episode of the second season, first aired in April of 2011, that most people watch without noticing. It is a name, Muscle Man, the loud and sweat-stained groundskeeper who has spent every prior appearance defined only by that title, is given a real one. He is Mitch Sorenstein, and once you know it, the joke that the series would keep telling about him, the running idea that nobody knows or remembers his name, becomes impossible to sustain. Consider first what the episode is actually about, because the name arrives inside a story that has nothing to do with identity on the surface. Muscle Man has been dumped by his girlfriend Starla, and the loss flattens him. He becomes too depressed to work. His chores at the park do not stop existing because he is sad, and so Mordecai and Rigby, who spend most of the series avoiding their own labor, end up doing his for him. That is the engine of the episode. A man is heartbroken, and the ordinary machinery of the park keeps demanding motion, and two other people absorb the difference. It is a gentler premise than the show usually admits to. The rescue effort belongs to High Five Ghost, who cares enough about his friend to try to fix the breakup directly. He brings Mordecai and Rigby to Starla's workplace, the plan being simple, to get her back together with Muscle Man. The plan fails in the way these plans always fail in this show. Instead of softening toward the man she left, Starla develops a crush on Mordecai. The instrument of the reconciliation becomes the new obstacle to it, and Mordecai, who did not want any of this, is suddenly the person standing between Muscle Man and the thing he wants most. What Mordecai does next is worth sitting with, because it is a strange and slightly sad piece of strategy. He briefly dates Starla. He does not do it out of interest. He does it as a maneuver, planning to dump her so that she will, in her hurt, return to Muscle Man. Think about the emotional logic there. He decides the fastest route back to Muscle Man's happiness is to make Starla feel a smaller version of the same rejection that started the whole episode. He breaks up with her at the coffee shop, and the plan, improbably, works, but not because of Mordecai. It works because Muscle Man is there to calm her down. In that moment, the two of them reconcile, and the episode closes its loop. The man who could not get out of bed is the one who steadies her. Starla sits at the center of all of this, and she is voiced by Courtney Taylor, giving the character enough warmth that the reconciliation lands as something earned rather than merely plotted. Muscle Man himself is voiced, across the entire series, by Sam Marin, who also gives voice to Benson and to Pops. Hold that fact for a second, because it is easy to pass over. A single performer supplies the park's angriest authority figure, its gentlest innocent, and its crudest loudmouth. Marin is doing three completely different registers of masculinity in the same show, and Muscle Man is the one built almost entirely out of bravado, which makes the vulnerability in this episode a real departure for the voice. But return to the name, because that is the reason this chapter exists. Mitch Sorenstein. The show hands it over inside a story about grief and reconciliation, almost casually, and in doing so it commits itself to a fact that its own comedy would rather forget. Muscle Man is a persona. It is a costume worn over a person named Mitch. And the series, having established this, spends years afterward mining humor from the premise that Muscle Man has no name anyone can hold on to, that he is only ever the title, only ever the joke. Those two things cannot both be true, and the series never resolves the tension. It simply lets both run. Here is where the contradiction sharpens rather than softens. Years later, in Cube Bros, an episode of the 7th season that aired in April of 2016, the name is not only remembered, it is expanded. Muscle Man reveals that Mitch is short for Mitchell. His full name is Mitchell Sorenstein. Think about what that does to the running gag. To say the diminutive is short for the full form, you must know both. The series is not treating the name as a lost or buried fact here. It is treating it as something so settled that it can be elaborated, deepened, turned into a small reveal of its own. The joke about nobody knowing his name and the joke about the etymology of his first name are standing in the same series, contradicting each other, and neither one blinks. And Cube Bros does something else that makes the identity question heavier. In that episode, Muscle Man quits his groundskeeping job at the park and takes an office job, because he is tired of being valued only for his physical strength. Read that against the name. The whole complaint of the episode is that people see the muscle and not the man. that the persona has swallowed the person underneath it. He wants to be Mitchell, a person with a mind and a future, and not Muscle Man, a body that lifts things. The series gives him this genuinely poignant grievance, while simultaneously running a joke that says the world cannot even retain his name. The grievance and the joke are two sides of the same wound, and the writers seem only half aware that they are. This was not the first time the series pointed the character toward shedding the persona. 2 years earlier, in The End of Muscle Man, the 5th episode of the 6th season, aired at the end of October in 2014, he fakes a terminal illness so that the park staff will grant his bucket list. The secret underneath the scheme is the important part. He is planning to retire the Muscle Man persona entirely and to propose to Starla, the same Starla from the 2nd season, as a changed man. So the series had already told us, plainly, that the man knows Muscle Man is a role he can put down. He has a name to return to. He has a self that exists when the loudness stops. The bucket list is a deception, but the wish behind it is sincere, and that wish is to stop being the joke and become the person. What emerges when you line these 3 episodes up is a character the writers understood far better than their own recurring gag allowed. In Muscle Woman, they gave him a name and a heart, letting him be the one who calms the woman he loves. In The End of Muscle Man, they gave him the desire to abandon the persona and marry as his real self. In Cube Bros, they gave him the courage to actually walk away from the job that reduced him to a body, and they even lengthened his name into Mitchell, as if to insist on his personhood. Every one of those beats depends on the name mattering, on the man being known, and yet the low comedy of the series kept pretending he was nameless, a figure so anonymous that the not knowing was funny. My own reading, and I offer it as opinion, is that the contradiction is not a flaw so much as a confession. The show could not decide whether Muscle Man was a joke or a person, and rather than choose, it kept both. Mitch Sorenstein was always there, named since the 2nd season. The series just found it easier, most of the time, to forget him. There is an episode near the close of Season 3 that behaves strangely if you watch it as a piece of a larger record, rather than as a single half-hour of television. It is called Yes Dude Yes, and it originally aired on the 7th of May, 2012. On paper, its job is simple. It introduces a character, but the way it introduces her, and the material it reaches for to make her feel like she belongs, rearranges the shape of Mordecai's past, and once you notice the seam, it becomes difficult to unsee. The setup is a misunderstanding, which the series loves. Mordecai sees Margaret react with sudden delight to news about her cousin John, who has received a new prosthetic leg. He does not see the cause. He only hears the sound of her joy. The words, "Yes, dude, yes," shouted across the distance between them, and from that fragment, he assembles the worst possible interpretation. He decides that she has accepted a marriage proposal from another man. Everything that follows in the episode grows out of that single misheard sentence, a small error of perception that the story treats as a wound. Rigby, watching his friend sink, responds the way Rigby usually responds, which is to act first and consider consent afterward. He signs the depressed Mordecai up for an online dating website called Couple Corral without asking him. The gesture is meant kindly, in its clumsy way, an attempt to shake Mordecai loose from his grief over Margaret by force. And the machinery of that website is what carries the rest of the episode. Mordecai is shown going on dates with 12 different women, at 12 different restaurants, one after another, a montage of mismatches that the series uses to measure how far he is willing to go to feel something other than what he feels. Then comes the last of them. CJ is introduced as Mordecai's final Couple Corral date, and she is a girl made of storm clouds. She wins him over with a tomboyish attitude, an ease that none of the previous 11 had, and for a moment, the episode seems to be offering him a way out of his sadness. This is her debut. The 7th of May, 2012, is the first time the series ever puts her on screen. Everything the audience knows about CJ begins here, in this episode, at the end of a montage. And that is what makes one particular scene worth slowing down over. During the episode, Mordecai and CJ spend time together at an arcade, and in the middle of that hangout, the series does something small and easy to miss. Mordecai is shown finishing telling CJ the story of the events of an earlier episode, High Score. That earlier episode is the 7th entry of Season 2. It aired on the 7th of February 2011, more than a year of real broadcast time before CJ ever appeared. So think about what that scene is actually doing. It is folding CJ into a history she was not part of. This is the continuity friction at the center of the chapter, and it is worth being precise about, because it is not the kind of contradiction that a single line of dialogue causes. It is a structural one. When Mordecai finishes recounting High Score to CJ, the series is treating her as a natural confidant for a story from his past, someone to whom it makes sense to narrate the milestones of his life. But she has existed, from the audience's point of view, for only a few minutes. The episode borrows the weight of an older, established event and lends that weight to a brand new relationship, so that CJ arrives already feeling like someone who has been around long enough to be told the old stories. The effect is intimacy. The cost is a small tear in the timeline, because there is no room in what the series has shown us for CJ to have been present, or even known, when the events she is being told about took place. You can read this generously, and I think you should, at least partly. Telling someone the story of your past is exactly what people do on an early date. It is a way of handing over a piece of yourself. So on the level of character behavior, nothing is wrong. Mordecai recounting High Score to CJ is an utterly ordinary thing to do. The strangeness only appears when you hold the episode up against the calendar of the series itself, when you remember that High Score belongs to Season 2 and February of 2011, and that CJ belongs to Season 3 and May of 2012, and that the second of those things is being used to make the first feel shared. The show is reaching backward to give a new character roots, and the roots do not quite reach the ground. The rest of Yes Dude Yes then works against itself in a way that compounds the problem. Mordecai invites CJ to the exact same movie he had originally planned to ask Margaret to see. The choice is careless, and the episode knows it is careless, because it is built to detonate. When CJ later overhears Mordecai ask Margaret to that same movie, the one she thought was theirs, she transforms into a massive storm cloud and wrecks the coffee shop with rain and wind and lightning before he manages to talk her down. Her nature as a creature of weather becomes literal here. The emotion is the storm, and the storm is the damage, and the coffee shop absorbs both. By the end, everything Mordecai reached for has slipped out of his hands. He loses CJ as a friend over the incident, and Margaret, who had earlier accepted the invitation to that movie, backs out of it as well. He is left holding nothing, which is the same place he started, except that now two relationships have been strained instead of one. The misheard sentence at the beginning has done its full work. Here is where the continuity question widens beyond a single arcade scene. Watch how the series treats CJ from this point forward, and the debut episode starts to look even odder in hindsight, because Yes Dude Yes ends with Mordecai and CJ parting, with her leaving as a friend after the storm, and yet the series would later frame their romance as if it were only just beginning much further down the line. The Season 5 finale, an episode called Real Date, which aired on August the 14th, 2014, is explicitly presented in its own synopsis as Mordecai and CJ going on their first ever real, romantic date together. First ever. 2 full seasons after they met over a movie invitation and a wrecked coffee shop. Sit with the tension in that word. The two of them spent a whole episode together in Season 3. He took her to an arcade. He told her the story of his past. He invited her to a movie, which is, by any ordinary definition, asking someone on a date, and the entire emotional collapse of Yes Dude Yes depends on CJ having understood it that way, because that is why the storm comes. And then, seasons later, the show labels a different outing their first real date, as though the earlier one did not count, as though the couple corral encounter and everything that grew from it could be set aside. It is not a contradiction in the hard sense of one fact canceling another. It is a softer thing, a retelling of the beginning that does not quite match the beginning we were shown. This is the pattern that keeps surfacing when you look closely at how the series manages CJ's backstory. Her debut reaches into Mordecai's past to borrow depth it has not earned yet, having him finish telling her about High Score as if she were an old confidant. And her future reaches back over her debut to reframe it, calling a later outing the first real date and letting the movie invitation of Season 3 fade into something less than what the episode itself insisted it was. The character is anchored at both ends by moments that do not sit flush against the record around them. None of this makes Yes Dude Yes a bad episode. It is a well-built one, tight and painful in the way it does best, and it launches a character who would matter enormously to the series, voiced across her entire run by the same performer throughout, and given, on the wiki that catalogs these things, the full name Cloudy J, the source of the initials everyone actually uses. What it does show is how a series that runs for years accumulates its small dishonesties, not through carelessness in any single scene, but through the ordinary pressure of wanting each new relationship to feel deep the moment it arrives, and wanting each later milestone to feel like a first. The arcade conversation gives CJ a past she cannot really have. The Season 5 finale takes away a date she already went on. Between those two gestures, the truest version of when Mordecai and CJ actually began becomes a little harder to locate. And perhaps that is the honest reading of it. The show is not lying to you so much as it is telling the same story twice, from two different distances, and hoping you will not lay the two accounts side by side. When you do, the Stormcloud girl who wrecks a coffee shop in Season 3 and the woman going on her first real date in Season 5 turn out to be standing on slightly different ground, each episode certain of a beginning the other quietly disagrees with. There is a difference between a show that uses the word death and a show that means it, and regular show spends most of its run refusing to settle on which kind of show it is. The word appears early and often, usually as decoration. In the 4th episode of the first season, Death Punchies, Rigby learns a move lifted from an advertisement for something called Death Kwon-do, a punch whose name simply stacks the word on itself, and that layering tells you exactly how seriously to take it. A punch of death, from a death art, and the joke is partly that the name promises annihilation and delivers a slapstick rampage. Rigby goes destructive with the stolen move, and Mordecai stops him with another stolen move, the death jump. Two deaths canceling each other out, and nobody actually dies. This is the show's first posture toward mortality, and it is a shrug. Death here is a brand name, a flavor, a way of making a martial art sound dangerous. Hold that in mind, because the series is about to introduce a character with the same name, and it will spend years unable to decide whether he is a joke or a threat. That character arrives in the 21st episode of the 2nd season, Over the Top, and his arrival is genuinely a killing. Rigby cheats during an arm wrestling match. Skips does not know, and in the course of the match, Skips accidentally kills him. This is not a fake-out, and it is not a brand name. Rigby is dead, and death, capital D, arrives to take his soul, which is the strongest statement the series has made to this point, that dying is a real event with a real consequence. And then, in the same episode, the show begins the pattern it will never fully escape. Skips uses a device called the Arm Boy to beat death in an arm wrestling match, wagering Rigby's soul against the outcome, and he wins. Death honors the bet. He revives Rigby. The permanence that the death seemed to establish lasts only as long as it takes to set up a contest and win it. Death does add one condition as he leaves, a vow that he will collect Skips's soul someday, which is the series acknowledging that it has just undone a death and trying to bank the debt for later. That someday, as far as this chapter is concerned, does not arrive. The revival itself carries a small production history worth pausing on, because it shows the machinery underneath. In the original United States broadcast, Death revives Rigby by spitting into his mouth. In some edited versions that were shown later, the same moment was altered so that Death instead shoots a laser from his finger. The event is identical. Rigby is dead, and then Rigby is alive. What changed was only the method, softened from something bodily and strange to something clean and cartoonish. And the fact that the moment could be swapped out so easily tells you how little the mechanism ever mattered. The series was never interested in the physics of coming back. It was interested in the deal that earned the coming back, and it would keep building episodes around those deals. By the 3rd episode of the 3rd season, Skip Strikes, the deal has become a whole plot, and the stakes have inverted. Rigby bets the souls of the entire park crew against Death's team, the Magical Elements, in a bowling championship. If the crew loses, Death's team collects every one of their souls, which is an escalation, more lives on the table than ever before. But watch what actually happens. The park strikers win. And rather than any park worker losing a soul, Rigby collects Death's soul instead, sealed inside a bowling ball as his side of the wager. Consider the reversal there. In Over the Top, Death came to take a soul and left having given one back. Now, the crew does not merely survive the encounter. They capture Death himself, reduce him to an object they can hold. Death has gone from a force that arrives uninvited to an opponent you can beat at a game and pocket. The threat is real enough to structure the plot, and never real enough to cost anyone anything. The next appearance completes the domestication. In Dead at 8, the 27th entry of that same season, Death threatens to take Muscle Man's soul after a near-fatal accident on a water slide, and for a moment, the old menace is back, a soul demanded because a body nearly gave out. Then Death agrees to spare him, and the price is not a contest or a bet but a chore. Mordecai and Rigby must babysit his son for the evening. Think about what that does to the figure. The being who once arrived to collect a dead friend now needs a sitter, and the whole terror of him collapses into a domestic errand. The episode also gives Death a family, introducing Thomas, his son, a demon-like figure who is more than 300 years old and disguises himself as a baby, a creature that has existed for 3 centuries, wearing the shape of an infant, watched over by the 2 park workers as a favor. The show is telling you plainly here that Death is no longer an ending. He is a neighbor with a kid and a schedule. Around the same stretch, in Trucker Hall of Fame, the 30th entry of the season, the series tests a different kind of death, one that does not involve the character at all, and finds it just as porous. Muscle Man's father dies. The manner of it is absurd, mauled by a real bear that he mistook for a cop wearing a bear costume, a confusion that would be unbearable if the series let it sit as grief. It does not let it sit. The father returns almost immediately as a ghost, and in that form he saves Muscle Man, Mordecai, and Rigby from the truckers who threaten them. And then he comes back again, in a later episode called Power Tower, to congratulate his son. A father can die, and still fight for you, and still show up to be proud of you. The death happened, technically, but it removed almost nothing. It moved the character to a different register of existence, ghost, instead of living, from which he could still act and still speak. This is the show's gentlest form of the walkback, the death that is honored as an event and then declines to function as a loss. The word keeps returning to its decorative use even as the character keeps appearing, and the two never quite reconcile. In the 14th episode of the 4th season, Sandwich of Death, Death is once again a brand, sold by an establishment called Death Kwando Pizza and Subs, the same fictional franchise whose advertisement started Rigby's trouble back in the 1st season. The sandwich is cursed to kill anyone who eats it without wearing cut-off jean shorts and a mullet, which is the kind of rule that announces its own silliness. And yet the curse is real inside the episode. The Double Death Sandwich, the more dangerous version, kills Master Sensei during the events. So even in the most cartoonish framing, with a death you avoid by dressing a certain way, someone actually dies. The series cannot help it. It reaches for death as a punchline and then lets the punchline land as a body. The branding and the reality bleed into each other, and the effect over time is that no one, watching, can be sure which deaths will hold. Which is exactly what makes the 22nd episode of the 5th season, Skips' story, land the way it does. In the flashback that gives Skips his origin, set in the 1800s, his love interest Desdemona dies at the end, and she is not revived. No bet is made, no game is won, no ghost returns, no laser undoes it. She simply dies, and stays dead, which by this point in the series is the genuinely unusual outcome. Set her against everything that came before. Rigby died and came back. Muscle Man was threatened and spared. Muscle Man's father died and returned as a ghost. Twice. Death himself was captured in a bowling ball. Against that record of reversals, a death that holds carries a weight it almost never asks its deaths to carry. The rarity is the point. Because the series had trained its audience to expect the walkback, the one time it refuses the walkback becomes the most serious moment about mortality it has. Skips' grief is real precisely because the show, for once, does not offer him a way out of it. That contrast tells you the series always knew the difference between a death it meant and a death it did not. It could make one stick when it wanted to. which means every revival was a choice, not a limitation, and the choices kept trending toward mercy. By the later seasons, the presence of Death becomes so familiar that the series can use him as pure misdirection. In the 5th episode of the 6th season, The End of Muscle Man, Death visits Muscle Man, and the crew believes he is dying. The whole premise leans on everything the audience has learned to feel when Death appears. And then it turns out to be a ruse. Muscle Man is not dying. He staged the whole thing so that he could propose to Starla as Muscle Man one last time, using Death's presence as a red herring rather than an actual ending. Sit with what that requires. For the trick to work, Death has to be recognizable enough to signal mortality and hollow enough to be safely faked. The show is spending the seriousness it built in over the top to buy a fake-out in Season 6. The character who once took Rigby's soul is now a prop in a marriage proposal. By the 26th episode of that same season, Death Kwon Do Livery, the circle is closed all the way back to where it began. Mordecai and Rigby travel to a Death Kwon Do hospital to get the Death Kwon Do sensei a new stomach, because his unhealthy eating habits have begun to threaten his life. The peril is genuine in the sense that a life is at stake, and it is mundane in the sense that the cause is a bad diet and the solution is a new organ. And once again, the word death is doing decorative work, attached to a hospital, attached to the same fictional martial art that supplied the first of these death jokes 6 seasons earlier. The series ends its run with mortality exactly where it started it, as a brand name laid over a survivable problem, with all the real dyings and undyings stacked in between. What accumulates across these episodes is not a broken rule, but a refusal to hold one. Death is permanent when Skips loses Desdemona, and negotiable when Skips beats Death at arm wrestling. It is a soul-taking force in the 2nd season, and a bowling opponent in the 3rd, and a babysitting arrangement by the end of that same season. A father can die and stay a father. A sensei can be killed by a sandwich in one episode and saved by a hospital in another, both under the same borrowed word. The show never lies to you about any single death while it is happening. It simply declines to promise that the next one will work the same way. And if you were listening for a consistent law of how dying functions in this world, the honest answer the series gives, over 8 seasons, is that the law is whatever the episode needs, and only once in a long while is what the episode needs the truth that dead means gone. There is a particular kind of attention that only arrives late, long after the story has stopped mattering, and the plot has resolved into something you no longer need to follow. It is the attention of the eye left with nothing urgent to do, free to wander the edges of the frame. And when the eye wanders through the first season of regular show, it begins to find things. Small things, a pole that should be there and is not, a tail that exists in one shot and does not exist in the next. These are the fingerprints of people working quickly, drawing frame after frame, and this chapter is about those fingerprints, gathered from the goof logs that fans have kept over the years like collectors pressing flowers. Consider the series premiere, The Power. There is a golf cart, and the group vanishes from it, and in the moment of that vanishing, the cart itself gives something away. Its roof is held up by support poles, and one of them, the 4th, is simply missing. The roof floats on 3 where it should rest on 4. Register that for a second. The cart is a rigid object, drawn again and again across the series, and yet in this early moment the structure that holds it together has lost a leg. Nobody notices in the flow of watching, because the eye is following the disappearance of the characters and not auditing the architecture of a golf cart. That is exactly how these errors survive. They hide behind whatever the scene wants you to look at instead. Move forward to the 3rd episode, Caffeinated Concert Tickets, which turns out to be unusually generous with its small failures, as if the production were still finding its footing. Skips is talking about the concert, and while he talks, Rigby's tail disappears. Rigby is a raccoon, and the tail is not a detail, it is half the silhouette of the character. It goes, and then in the very next shot it comes back, restored as though nothing happened. There is something almost comic about how casual this is. The animators drew a raccoon without the most raccoon part of him, and the scene simply carried on, because Skips was speaking and the words were where the attention lived. The same episode has a door that cannot decide what it is doing. Benson throws the keys to Rigby, and behind that gesture, the garage door is open. A short while later, Benson drives off in the cart, and the garage door is shown locked, closed. Between those two moments, nobody closed it on screen, and the logic of the space contradicts itself. A door is a simple thing, open or shut, one or the other. Yet here it is both, depending on which shot you freeze, and the only reason it passes is that a thrown set of keys and a departing cart are livelier than a door, and the eye follows the livelier thing every time. And then there is the strangest of the three, which is not a drawing error at all, but a sound one. Rigby, briefly, shouts a line in Mordecai's voice instead of his own. The words are, "Oh geez," and they come out of the wrong throat. This is worth sitting with, because it is a different category of mistake entirely. The visual errors are the hand slipping. This is the ear slipping, the wrong take married to the wrong character. Two voices that belong to two performers momentarily crossed. For a single line, Rigby is speaking with his best friend's voice, and if you have ever half listened to this show while drifting off, you may have felt something faintly wrong in that moment without being able to name it. The fourth episode, Death Punches, is built around violence, around Rigby delivering an unbroken stream of what the series calls death punches, and violence is hard to draw consistently because injuries are supposed to accumulate. They are supposed to get worse. Instead, they flicker. Muscle Man has black, bruised eyes, and partway through that continuous punching, the eyes appear fully healed, the bruising gone, and then after the death jump, they return, injured again. The wound heals in the middle of the beating and then reopens. There is no logic that can hold this together, because the whole point of a continuous assault is that nothing gets better while it is happening. The animation forgot its own timeline for a shot or two. Pops is in that same episode, and his arm is in a sling, and the sling behaves the way so many props behave in early regular show. It disappears and reappears between shots, inconsistently, with no rule you could write down. In one frame, the arm is bound and cared for, in the next it is free, and then it is bound again. A sling is a marker of injury, a small piece of continuity that is supposed to remind you that something happened to this character, and instead it blinks in and out like a light with a loose connection. You could almost read it as the injury itself being uncertain, the series unsure how hurt Pops is meant to be. There is a third failure in Death Punches, and it is the quietest of all. In the moment right before Mordecai and Rigby's confrontation, Skips and Pops both vanish from the background. They are simply not drawn. The scene clears its stage for the two leads, and in doing so, it forgets to keep the other bodies present. This one I find genuinely interesting, because it may not be laziness at all. It may be instinct. The confrontation is between two characters, and some part of the production wanted nothing else in the frame, and so the others evaporated. Whether that was a decision or an accident, the effect is the same. The world empties out to make room for the argument, and if you are watching the corners, you see two friends disappear, so two other friends can fight. The sixth episode, Meet Your Maker, gives us a bridge, and the bridge cannot decide what it is made of. In one shot, it is drawn as wood. A single cut later, it is cement or stone. The material changes across a single cut, and a bridge is not a living thing that could transform. It is fixed. It is supposed to be the steadiest object in a landscape, the thing you can rely on to be there and to be itself. Here it is timber and then masonry within the space of a heartbeat, and once you have seen it, you cannot unsee the way the whole surface swaps its nature between frames. But the richest single episode for this kind of study is the ninth, Prank Callers, which sends the characters back to the 1980s and, in doing so, seems to loosen every join in the animation at once. Start with Benson's entry door. It appears on the opposite side of the room from where it is normally shown. The geometry of a familiar space reverses, the door migrating across the room as though the building had been mirrored. Rooms in this show are drawn many times, and they build up a shape in your memory, and this is the show contradicting its own memory, putting the door where the door has never been. The same episode has trees that grow when they are not supposed to. When the characters travel back to the 80s, the trees are drawn small. By the time they escape that same time period, the trees are noticeably larger. The setting is meant to be a single moment in the past, a fixed place they arrive in and flee from, and yet the vegetation has visibly gained size across the sequence, as though real time had passed inside a scene that is supposed to be one continuous escape. Nothing in the story accounts for it. The trees simply drew bigger the second time around. Then there are the tinfoil headpieces, the little makeshift devices the characters use, which vanish partway through the time travel sequence. Props built for a specific purpose, present at the start of the journey and then gone before it ends, without being removed, without being lost, just absent. And most telling of all, in the 1980s flashback, Pops is shown without his signature mustache. This is the one I would point to if someone asked which error tells you the most. Pops without his mustache is barely Pops. It is the single most defining line on his face, drawn consistently across the entire rest of the series, and in this flashback it is simply not there. The character arrives in the past having left his own face behind. You can almost forgive a vanishing sling or a migrating door, but forgetting the mustache is forgetting who the character is. I want to pause on why Prank Callers fails so much more than the episodes around it. The door moves, the trees grow, the headpieces vanish, the mustache goes missing, all in one half of one episode. My honest reading, offered as opinion and not as fact, is that the time travel premise gave the production two versions of everything to keep track of, the present and the 80s, and doubling the world doubled the chances of a slip. When you have to draw the same room twice, once now and once then, the door has two chances to end up on the wrong wall. The past is a second copy of reality, and every copy is a place where errors breed. The 10th episode, Dawn, offers something subtler, a color error rather than a vanishing object. There is a football game, and Mordecai throws a ball of white socks at Rigby. White. Moments later, when Benson arrives, the same socks are colored. The object did not change, only the paint on it did, the palette shifting between one moment and the next, while the socks themselves stayed the same bundle of cloth. Color errors are their own species of mistake, harder to catch than a missing tail because the shape is intact and only the hue has drifted. But once you know the socks began white, the colored version reads as wrong in a way you can feel before you can explain. And the season closes this small catalog with the 12th episode, Mordecai and the Rigbys, and a shirt that goes missing off a character's back. Rigby is wearing his band t-shirt when he goes to find Pops. Then Pops says his line about everyone knowing about the show, and in that moment the shirt is gone from Rigby's body. Not changed, not removed on screen. Simply absent, the character undressed by a lapse in continuity between the walking in and the being spoken to. A band shirt is a costume, a piece of who Rigby is meant to be in that scene, and it evaporates precisely when the attention shifts to what Pops is saying. That is the pattern under all of these, if you lay them side by side. The tale goes while Skips talks. The background empties while the friends prepare to fight. The socks change color while Benson arrives. The shirt vanishes while Pops delivers his line. In almost every case, the error hides behind the thing the scene wants you to watch. The animators, working at speed, protected whatever mattered most in each shot and let the edges drift, and our own eyes, following the story, colluded with them by looking exactly where they hoped we would look. These mistakes are not really visible during ordinary watching. They only surface when the story loosens its grip, when you have seen the episode enough times that the plot no longer holds you, and the attention slides outward to the pole that is missing, the door on the wrong wall, the mustache that never got drawn. The people cataloging these goofs are not mocking it. They are watching it the way you watch something you love, closely enough to see the hand that made it, present in every place that hand slipped. There is a strange thing that happens when you place two endings of the same story side by side and study how they disagree. Regular Show gave us two of them within roughly 14 months, and they do not merely differ in tone. They differ in what they believe the series was fundamentally about, and they differ in what they believe a life like Mordecai's or Rigby's is worth against the size of the cosmos. To see this clearly, you have to hold the movie and the finale in the same hand and notice how uncomfortably they sit together. Consider first how the movie came to us. Regular Show, the movie, had a limited theatrical run, beginning on August 14th in 2015 at a single theater in Los Angeles, the Downtown Independent, and playing there through the 20th. From there it moved to a digital release on the 1st of September, and only later, on the 25th of November that same year, did it premiere on Cartoon Network itself. So the film arrived almost privately, a thing you had to seek out before it came home to the channel that made it. And what it argued, in its bones, was that the fate of everything hinges on a single unrepaired friendship. The threat in the movie is called the Time-nado, a tornado made of space and time, and it is not the work of a god or a demon. It is an accident. A teenage Mordecai and a teenage Rigby build a time machine for a science fair. The machine malfunctions, and the wound it tears in reality is the thing that can end the universe. Weigh that as a premise. The apocalypse here is homemade. It comes from two ordinary boys and a project that went wrong, which is entirely in keeping with the register the series had always worked in, where cosmic consequences spill out of small suburban carelessness. The film then gives that accident a human shape. The Time-nado is weaponized by Mr. Ross, the boys' former high school science teacher and volleyball coach, who has become a cyborg warlord. His motive is not abstract. He wants revenge on Rigby specifically, because Rigby cost his team a championship, and that failure got Ross fired and jailed. Every piece of the danger, then, traces back to a grudge. The machine, the storm, the villain, all of it grows from a moment of adolescent thoughtlessness and the resentment it left behind in one wronged man. And so the resolution is fittingly intimate. The adult Mordecai and Rigby, estranged when the film begins, repair their friendship, and with that repair comes the means to win. They use plutonium taken from a future timeship to destroy the Time-nado, and destroying it erases their estranged, villainous future selves from existence. The climax also sends the group backward to convince a teenage Rigby to apologize to Mr. Ross before Ross is taken to jail, which ends the grudge that started the whole disaster in the first place. Notice the logic of that. The universe is saved not by superior force, but by an apology, delivered at the right moment to the right person. The film is telling you that the largest catastrophe imaginable can be unmade by two friends choosing each other and one boy saying he is sorry. Hold that thought, because the finale then arrives and quietly dismantles it. A regular epic final battle premiered on Cartoon Network on the 16th of January in 2017, roughly 14 months after the movie reached television. In its first part, the series reveals that Pops, the gentle, lollipop-headed man who had drifted through the background of nearly every episode, is in fact a cosmic being called Mega Cranus. He has an evil twin brother, Anti-Pops, whose name is given as Malum Cranus, and the two of them are fated to fight, and the outcome of that fight decides the fate of the universe. In a single stroke, the scale of the story changes completely. The danger no longer comes from within the world of the park. It was always outside it, older than any of them, wearing the disguise of the kindest character in the cast. The finale then does something the movie's logic cannot survive. It establishes that Pops and Anti-Pops are fated to battle again and again across some vast stretch of time, and that every prior battle has ended in a stalemate, and that each stalemate resets the entire universe. This is shown through ancient woven cloths depicting past incarnations of the park crew fighting alongside Pops in earlier cycles. Sit with the implication. The characters you have followed are not unique. They are recurrences. There have been countless Mordecais and countless Rigbys before these ones, each pair playing out a version of the same struggle, each erased when the cycle turned over. The universe has ended and begun again more times than anyone can count, and no apology ever stopped it. That is the first place the two endings refuse to square. The movie insists that erasing a threat from existence is a triumph, a clean victory. The villainous future selves simply gone and the timeline made whole. The finale reveals that erasure on the grandest scale is not a victory at all, but a routine, a thing that has happened again and again for as long as there has been anything, and that the erasing solves nothing because the cycle only resets and repeats. What the movie treats as the exception, the finale treats as the rule. The second part of the finale drives the point deeper still. Mordecai and Rigby position themselves directly between the colliding fists of Pops and Anti-Pops, and the resulting punch obliterates the entire universe. Compare that to the movie for a moment. In the film, the two friends stand at the center of the crisis, and their reconciliation saves everything. In the finale, the two friends stand at the center of the crisis, and everything is destroyed anyway. Their presence, their bond, their willingness to put themselves in the path of the blow, none of it holds the universe together. The blow lands, and the universe ends. The very gesture that was heroic in one story is simply overwhelmed in the other. Then the third part restarts the whole show as a direct replay of the series' first episode, The Power, with only Mordecai and Rigby retaining their memories of the timeline that was lost. Here again, the finale seems to answer the movie and reverse its verdict. The movie went back in time to fix a mistake, to reach a teenage Rigby and change what he did, and treated that revision as salvation. The finale goes back to the very beginning of everything and offers no revision at all. Only a return, the same first day starting over, with two people carrying the grief of knowing it has all happened before. Time travel in the movie is a tool for winning. Time in the finale is a wheel, and the most you can do is remember. What finally breaks the cycle is not a repair and not an apology. Pops permanently ends the resetting of the universe by embracing his brother Anti-Pops and flying with him into a star, sacrificing his own life. And that act also revives all the allies Anti-Pops had erased during the battle. Set that beside the movie one more time. In the film, salvation cost the boys nothing permanent. Their friendship was restored, the grudge was dissolved, the villain's origin was talked away, and the world went on with its people intact. In the finale, salvation costs a life. The kindest character in it has to die, has to choose to die, to stop a pattern that no reconciliation between friends could ever have touched. The movie says the universe can be saved by two people choosing each other. The finale says the universe can only be saved when someone chooses to give himself up entirely, and that no bond between equals is enough. And this is where the disagreement becomes something closer to a wound. The movie's entire moral architecture rests on the idea that Mordecai and Rigby are the load-bearing pillars of their world, that fixing them fixes reality. The finale gently sets them aside. It reveals that the real struggle was between two ancient brothers who predate them by billions of years, that the boys were participants but never the authors, and that when the decisive moment came, they could stand between the fists and still fail to stop the blow. The friendship that the movie made into the fulcrum of the cosmos is, in the finale, one small human thing inside a machine far too large for it. There is a way to make the two fit, if you want to. You can say the movie was about the scale of their lives, and the finale was about the scale of the universe, and that both are true at once, a small salvation nested inside a vast indifference. But the endings themselves do not offer you that comfort. They make opposite claims about the same question. Does erasing a threat from time count as a victory? Does the presence of two friends at the center of a catastrophe protect anything? Can an apology, or a repaired bond, hold back the end of everything? The movie answers yes to each, plainly and warmly, and asks you to go home satisfied. The finale, arriving barely more than a year later, answers no to each, and asks a dying man to do what the friendship never could. The show does, in the end, give its people ordinary lives to land in. The closing montage jumps forward 25 years and hands out definitive fates. Mordecai becomes a painter and, by most accounts of the montage, settles down and marries. Rigby marries Eileen and has 2 daughters. Benson becomes the park owner and marries Pam. These are gentle, human futures, and they are the finale's quiet peace offering. But notice that they are granted only after the universe has ended, after Pops has died, after the wheel has been broken by sacrifice rather than repair. The small happy life that the movie promised as the reward for friendship arrives in the finale only on the far side of a loss the movie never imagined was necessary. By the time a show has finished its run, the people who made it are not usually the ones cataloging its flaws. That work falls to someone else. In the case of regular show, it fell to the fans, and they did it with a thoroughness that is easy to underestimate. On the regular show wiki, hosted on Fandom, there is a page whose title tells you exactly what it is for. It is called the List of Goofs in Regular Show, and it does precisely what it says. It gathers, episode by episode, the animation and continuity errors that viewers noticed while watching, and it lays them out in order, a running ledger of every scene that showed. Consider what that page actually represents. Nobody was paid to build it. No studio commissioned it. It exists because a certain kind of viewer watched carefully enough to catch the moment when a background stopped agreeing with itself, and then cared enough to write it down where the next person could find it. The wiki even formalized the habit. On its official policies page, the site instructs its own editors on how to file these observations. Any animation or continuity error found within an episode, the policy says, should be documented under a heading called goofs. For the expanded media, for the film, the editors are told to use a different word, errors, instead. That is a small distinction, but it is a revealing one. It means the community did not simply notice mistakes. It built a vocabulary for them, a filing system, a rule about which shelf each kind of flaw belongs on. And once you look at the individual entries, you begin to see the texture of what these viewers were catching. There is a shot involving the golf cart, that familiar green vehicle the characters are forever driving across the park. In one moment, as the group vanishes from it, the cart is missing the fourth support pole that holds up its roof. 3 poles where there should be 4. It is the sort of thing you would never see at speed, watching once, half asleep. But the wiki records it, patiently, because someone froze the frame and counted. There is the matter of Rigby's tail, which turns out to be a recurring problem in more ways than one. In a single documented sequence, while Skips is talking about a concert, Rigby's tail is simply missing from one shot. And then, one shot on, it is back where it belongs. The tail leaves and returns within the span of a cut. The character did not lose anything. The drawing did. And the wiki notes it with the same even tone it uses for everything else, as though a raccoon's tail flickering out of existence for a single shot were a perfectly ordinary thing to keep track of. The garage door gives us another. In one scene, the door is open when Benson throws Rigby the keys. Moments later, when Benson drives off in the cart, that same door is shown locked. Both states cannot be true. The door cannot be open for the toss and locked for the departure, unless something happened in between that the episode never shows us. It is a tiny logical fracture, the kind that the eye slides right past because the emotional beat of the scene carries you forward. The wiki does not slide past. It stops, it names the contradiction, and it moves on to the next. Some of the goofs are not visual at all. There is a voice recording slip that the list preserves, a moment where Rigby's line, the words, "Oh geez," comes out in Mordecai's voice instead of Rigby's. Picture that as a production event. 2 performers, 2 characters who spend nearly every scene together, and a single line that landed in the wrong throat and made it all the way to broadcast. It is the kind of error that would be almost impossible to catch unless you already knew these 2 voices as intimately as the fans did, unless the sound of Rigby and the sound of Mordecai were separate and settled things in your ear. Only a devoted listener hears that slip. And a devoted listener wrote it down. Then there are the ones that betray how the world itself was assembled. A bridge appears, and Mordecai and Rigby run toward it, and it is made of wood. In the next shot, the same bridge is made of cement or stone. The material of a solid structure changed between 2 frames, quietly, as if the world could not quite decide what it was built from. And in an episode involving time travel back to the 1980s, the 2 of them wear tinfoil hats, and those hats simply disappear between shots. Here on their heads, gone the next moment, with no scene to account for their removal. These are not errors of story. They are errors of continuity, of the physical universe failing to hold still, and the wiki gathers them all under the same calm heading. What strikes me, sitting with all of this, is not that the mistakes exist. Every animated series accumulates them. What strikes me is the shape of the response. The fandom did not treat these flaws as embarrassments to be hidden. They treated them as data. The Goofs page is not an attack on the show. It is an act of attention, and attention of this order is a form of love, even when it looks like a complaint. That becomes clearer when you notice that the Goofs page does not stand alone. The same wiki maintains separate catalog pages built the same way, by the same crowdsourced hands. There is a list of trivia in regular show. There is a list of pop culture references in regular show. These are distinct efforts, organized apart from the Goofs tracking, and together they sketch the outline of a community that wanted to document everything. Not only the errors, but the references, the small facts, the buried nods to other films and games. The mistakes were simply one column in a much larger ledger of a world the fans refused to let go unrecorded. The errors were cataloged with the same care as the treasures, because to the person doing the cataloging, both were part of the same object of study. Beyond the wiki, the conversation took a different form, and in some ways a more interesting one. On TV Tropes, there is a page devoted to regular show under a category called head scratchers. A head scratcher is not quite a goof. A goof is a mistake you can point to, a pole that should be there and is not. A head scratcher is a question the series raises and never answers, an inconsistency that lives in the logic of the world rather than in a single frame. And this is where the fans stopped being auditors and became something closer to theorists. They ask, for instance, how the cast survived on the moon in the season 1 premiere without any oxygen. The show puts them up there and expects you to accept it, and for most viewers, the momentum of the story is enough. But someone stopped and asked the plain physical question, and once it is asked, it cannot be unasked. There is no air on the moon. The characters are breathing. The premiere never explains the gap, and so the gap became a topic, something to be debated in earnest by people who took the world seriously enough to want it to make sense. The same page holds an entry the fans call Cast of Snowflakes, and it circles a question that sits underneath the entire series. Why are the park employees and their relatives drawn as anthropomorphic animals and objects? A talking bird, a talking raccoon, a gumball machine that manages the staff, while nearly everyone else in the show's world is an ordinary human being. The main characters are the exceptions. The background is populated with normal people, and the series never tells you why its central figures should be so different in kind from the world they move through. It is a question the writers may never have intended anyone to ask, and yet, once you see it, it reframes every crowd scene. You start to notice how alone these creatures are, how strange, surrounded by a humanity they resemble only in behavior. There is an entry called Anachronistic Stew, and it worries at something many longtime viewers eventually feel. The video games inside it are drawn in 8-bit style, the blocky graphics of an older era. The media in that world runs on VHS tapes, and yet other elements do not match that vintage at all. So the fans debate what decade the series is actually set in, because the evidence points in several directions at once. The technology of the world does not agree with itself, and rather than treating that as a flaw, the community treated it as a puzzle worth solving, a question that might have an answer if only enough people compared enough details. And the tale returns one final time, now not as an animation goof, but as a matter of anatomy. On the Head Scratchers page, fans debate the placement of Rigby's tail relative to where a real raccoon's tail actually sits. The concern is that it is drawn in an anatomically odd position. The theories split. Some argue it is simply rule of funny, a choice made because it works for the comedy and the design, not because it needs to be correct. Others insist it is a plain animation mistake that got locked in and repeated, that the same feature appears on both the wiki's goofs list as a tail that vanishes and returns, and on the tropes page as a tail drawn in the wrong place, tells you how much scrutiny fell on this one small part of one small character. A raccoon's tail became a subject of genuine disagreement among adults who had thought about it carefully. Now sit with the larger picture that these pages form together. We have the verified facts of what the fandom built, and they are considerable. A dedicated goofs page, a formal editorial policy for how to record errors, companion catalogs for trivia and references, a whole tropes page where the deeper inconsistencies are argued out. What we do not have, among these facts, is any record of the crew stepping in to settle the matter. There is no interview here where a director explains the missing pole, no commentary track where a writer accounts for the locked garage door, no acknowledgement that the wrong voice on that one line was ever noticed by its makers. The reactions we can verify are the fans' reactions. The documentation we can point to is the documentation the community produced. Perhaps that is the truest thing this chapter can say. When a show goes out into the world, it stops being only the property of its creators. The errors become the audience's, to find, to name, to file under the right heading, to argue about on a Saturday afternoon years after the last episode aired. The crew moved on, the fans stayed, counting polls, listening for the wrong voice, asking how anyone breathed on the moon. And the record they left is not a list of failures. It is the shape of how closely they were watching, and how much they cared to be sure they had seen it right. The point was never to catch the series failing. A mistake, held up to the light, is only proof that many hands touched the same frame, that a background was painted before a script was final, that a color model changed between one season and the next, and nobody thought a sleeping listener would ever count the difference. Every error we walk through tonight is a fingerprint. It marks the place where a person made a choice under a deadline, where a cell was reused because reusing it was faster, where a voice was recorded in a different room, in a different year, and carried a memory the animation could not see. Regular show was made by people who cared enough about the small things to leave the small errors in, because chasing every one of them would have cost the warmth that made the show worth making. So the continuity slips, the shifting props, the coffee cup that empties and fills again, none of them break the world. They are the seams, and a thing with visible seams is a thing that was built by hand, held together, and handed to you. Picture the park at the end of a long day. The lights in the house go off one window at a time. The cart sits in the driveway, a little different than it was this morning, and nobody minds. The night settles over the trees, and the small, imperfect world keeps turning, quietly, whether or not anyone is watching closely enough to notice. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.